Okay, thanks, Jenny. So just a very, very quick means of introduction for today's webinar, and the presentations we're going to have from some early career scientists that are doing some very exciting work. So just in the broadest sense, we all know that large ensemble methods have been around for some time in both weather and climate studies. And at this point, the field is really getting much more diverse in terms of the resources available with models, as well as the kind of ideas that people are bringing in to these stories that are developing. And so today we're going to, again, from these early career people, be hearing about their work that in many cases was presented at the Large Ensemble workshop last summer in Boulder and further developed since then. So including the separation of forced and unforced climate change, air quality and health, marine biogeochemistry, model evaluation, and forced changes in internal variability. And just before turning it over to Clara, just to say it's been a really impressive process to watch this Clara variations issue develop. It's really very, very impressive and nice work by these early career people. So I'll turn it over to Clara, who will take us through the next slide.
All right, thanks, Keith, and thanks everyone for joining. We're very excited about this collection of papers. These are all citable papers in Clyvar variations, and they really span a range of new applications. So I thought, in lieu of having each speaker introduce what a large ensemble is in this context, I thought maybe we could all be on the same page. I just have a couple of slides to go over what is probably very familiar to most of you listening in. So we're speaking exclusively here about initial condition large ensembles, which is simply running multiple simulations with the same coupled model under the same radiative forcing scenario, where each simulation begins from slightly different initial conditions. And as you see in this, in the plot here of the global mean temperature record from the CESM1 large ensemble, days 1 through 60, from the beginning of the ensemble, in which the initial conditions were simply a round-off error perturbations to the air temperatures on the order of 10 to the minus 14 degrees K. And on the first day, and you can see that after the predictability on the weather time scale fades after 2 to 3 weeks, you can see the plume in which there's spread amongst the members, and this then carries over to climate timescales, which represents the source of internal variability that will always be superimposed upon any forced response. Jenny, we can do the next slide, please. So as if those of you who would like more general background on the types of applications and insights that can be derived from such initial condition large ensembles, the working group on large ensembles, co-chaired by myself and Keith, has written this perspective in Nature Climate Change, came out a few months ago, and that gives a substantial amount of background on large ensembles. Next, please. And then finally, one of the activities of the working group was to make available the data from 7 existing initial condition large ensembles with CMIP5 models at the time. And so there's one-stop shopping here. You can simply go to this web link and download the data directly from these 7 model large ensembles, whose ensemble sizes range from 16 to 100. So the data are all immediately available to anyone who would like to use them. And I think we'll be hearing from today's presentations that make use of the data in this archive. So I think you can go to the next slide, but I think that's all I wanted to say by means of introduction. And then I guess we should just get started on the topics here. And we've purposefully picked sort of cutting edge new areas that are being used or are being for which large ensembles are being applied. And I think you'll find a very interesting set of presentations today. So we'll begin with Robb Wills, who will speak about separating forced and unforced components of climate change and new pattern recognition methods that are being used. So go ahead, Robb. Thanks.
Thank you, Clara, for the introduction, and thank you, Clara, Keith, and Jenny, for organizing this this variations issue. It was fun to contribute to. So I'm going to be talking about separating forced and unforced components of climate change, which is, of course, a central issue that has motivated large ensembles. But in particular, I'm going to be talking about the use of pattern recognition methods and how they can help with this problem, whether you're looking at large ensembles or observations. This is work I did together with Sebastian Sippel and Libby Barnes. And basically what we try to do in this is just try to summarize the ways in which the combination of pattern recognition methods and large ensembles can help separate forced and unforced components of climate change. And so it's a little bit of a review, and I'll try to get through some of the stuff we talked about in the article. So just as a motivational example, I want you to consider the recent strengthening of the equatorial Pacific SST gradient, which the observed trend of which is shown in the top here, and shows this more warming of the Western Pacific compared to cooling or weak warming in the Eastern Pacific. That's quite different than what models show for hindcasts over the same time period using the same forcings. And there's been a lot of discussion in literature about why that is, with some studies pointing to model biases in the tropical Pacific, some to incorrect response to aerosol forcing, and some to the kind of more null hypothesis of just that this is some kind of natural multi-decadal variability. And distinguishing between these two mechanisms whether this is forced or unforced is very important for a whole range of applications, from validating models to understanding the observed changes, predicting the future pattern of warming as important for a global climate, or just knowing how much multi-decadal variability to expect in the future and to improve this prediction. So large ensembles have provided a useful way to, within a single model, say what is the forced and unforced component, because it allows the ensemble average, where you can average out multiple ensemble members to remove internal variability that varies in phase between realizations, allows this to be applied to a single model so that there's no conflation between intermodal differences and internal variability. However, there's still a lot of spatial temporal information in the forced climate response and in internal variability that's not really being taken advantage of in something as simple as an ensemble average. So one of the questions that we're dealing with in this variations article is, can pattern information be used in conjunction with large ensembles to better separate signal from noise? So specifically, I'm going to be talking about two types of pattern recognition problems. In one called signal to noise maximizing pattern analysis, pattern recognition methods are used to separate signal and noise within a single dataset, such as a climate model ensemble. And in the other, in detection and attribution applications, basically this is used to instead identify some known climate response from, for example, a climate model ensemble in a second dataset, such as observations. And in this presentation, I'll be showing you that using pattern information helps to characterize the time evolving pattern of climate change with fewer ensemble members compared to a simple ensemble average. And this helps to understand uncertainty in climate projections. And that training on detection and attribution methods on multiple large ensembles helps to improve the skill in identifying forced response in some unseen model, and presumably then in observations as well. So first I want to talk about just what is the benefit of using a spatial pattern. where can you best observe the climate system to see the climate signal? So this is a map of the signal to noise ratio as seen by the CESM Large Ensemble. So areas such as the subtropics and tropical land and subtropical oceans have a large ratio of forced climate signal to internal variability. But even these grid points that have the highest signal to noise ratio still have much lower signal to noise ratio than global mean surface temperature, and less still than the leading so-called signal to noise maximizing pattern, which I'll introduce in more detail on the next slide. So this basis of patterns instead provides a useful basis to separate patterns of signal and from patterns of noise. So signal to noise maximizing patterns are basically just a way of weighting some observations or modeled temperatures based on where they have high signal to noise ratio, such that you then get a time series with maximum signal to noise ratio. So this is showing all the different ensemble members of this pattern in the CESM large ensemble, and shows that they're tightly clustered about the ensemble mean, even more so than global mean surface temperature, and much more so than a regional average like US temperature. And then, so much like principal components and EOFs, multiplying this by the temperature data then gets you this pattern of change, which this is just representing the forced response of global warming. And you can find many more of these patterns. It's not just one pattern to represent the forced response. I won't get into the details of those. These patterns are discussed in more detail in my full-length Journal of Climate paper. But basically, by combining these different patterns, you can make a good estimate of the forced response and all of its spatial temporal variations. So what this then allows you to do is look at climate indices of interest, such as the Pacific SST gradient, and the time evolution of that is much clarified by this by filtering with these signal to noise maximizing patterns. So compared to a simple ensemble mean, which still has a lot of aliasing from ENSO noise and poor agreement between the red and blue lines, the two halves of the large ensemble, pattern filtering helps you see that there is actually a robust response, and helps you find it. There's this El Nino-like response to volcanic forcing and a weak El Nino-like trend in the recent period. Even for temperature changes that you can see within a simple ensemble average, it helps you clean that up. You get you really exactly what the forced response is. This helps you do analysis of the structural uncertainty in climate projections, such as looking across these 4 different ensembles and see how their Pacific SST gradient has evolved through the 20th century, and comparing that to observations. And it doesn't just allow you to look at the forced climate response within a large ensemble, but also lets you do it with fewer ensemble members, such that if you want to identify the forced response with some criterion, 80% correlation squared, in a large ensemble, this map shows you how many ensemble members you need with the simple ensemble mean versus this pattern-based approach. And where you would need over 20 ensemble members for most grid points using the simple ensemble mean approach, pattern filtering allows you to identify the forced response with good scale, with 4 or less members in most locations. And this holds also for large-scale indices. I won't get into more detail about this, but I just want to briefly mention that there are ways you can adapt this slightly to apply to single ensemble members or to observations, but there's some assumptions involved. So there's low-frequency component analysis, which I've worked a lot with recently, which is similar to signal noise maximizing patterns, but then signal is defined by variability on decadal and longer timescales rather than by this ensemble mean. And there's dynamical adjustment, which Sebastian has worked with, and so has Clara. And this determines patterns of noise based on their association with atmospheric circulation anomalies, and then filters those out. In both cases, there's assumptions involved, but large ensembles are really valuable to help validate these assumptions and then test the scale of these methods in identifying the forced response. So then I want to switch gears a little bit for the last couple of slides and discuss this other type of pattern recognition problem where the same type of information is being used to train a pattern detection method on a large ensemble, but then apply it to observed temperatures. So there's been recent work by Libby Barnes and Sebastian Sippel that draws on a large body of detection and attribution literature, but applies new methods such as regularized regression or artificial neural networks to detect forced climate change from individual days, months, or years of temperature data. So basically, it finds some detection fingerprint pattern from models that you then project observations onto, and you can see how that observations say this temperature pattern has changed over the observational period. And one thing we added in this variations article is instead of doing this with CMIP, as was in the last slide, to do this on 6 different large ensembles, and not just look at what the mean pattern is across these models, but how the pattern varies across the 6 different large ensembles. And in particular, we showed that which is mostly Sebastian's work, I should say, we showed that training ridge regression on multiple large ensembles at once helps to improve its skill on a model it hasn't yet seen. So rather than just train on one large ensemble, using the structural uncertainty across different models is helpful to improve the skill of these pattern recognition methods in recognizing the force response. And this might help in observations as well. So I want to just wrap up with some open questions. Barnes et al. And Sippel et al. Both detected the forced response from individual years of observed temperatures, but used quite different methods. Artificial neural networks versus regularized linear regression. So this artificial neural networks is a nonlinear method and presumably has some extra added benefit in some cases, but recognizing exactly when that helps you better identify the climate response, if it does, is still an open question. I think these methods can also be used for systematic model evaluation, but we still need to develop the ways in which to do that. Sorry, these methods. And so far, this has mostly been about temperature, so and mean changes in temperature, but these methods can apply just as well to changes in variance or changes in indices of extremes. So exploring how well this works in these other contexts will be valuable as well. In conclusion, pattern information provides a useful basis for separating forced and unforced components of climate change. This isn't just true in detection and attribution applications like observations. It can also help you identify force response within large ensembles using fewer ensemble members. And when you do want to apply these methods to observations, large ensembles provide a valuable testing ground to assess their skill. Methods like single noise maximizing pattern analysis help to identify the force response of fewer ensemble members and analyze the structural uncertainty between different models. We also found in this article that training pattern-based detection attribution methods on multiple large ensembles helps to improve their skill compared to just training them on one model. That's all I have. Thanks. I'll take questions. Hope I didn't go over time.
Great. Thank you, Rob. If you have any questions, don't forget to use the raise your hand button that's found next to your name, or you can type your question into the chat box. All right, I don't see any questions. If you do have any questions for Rob that comes up later, you can probably just type into the chat box and he can answer it there for you. So should we move on to the next speaker, Clara?
Sure, sounds good. Thank you so much, Rob. That was absolutely wonderful. So next we have Fernando Garcia-Menendez from North Carolina State University, and he will be speaking about internal climate variability and initial condition ensembles in air quality projections. So this was one of the very new applications that we heard about at the workshop last summer, and we were very excited to have him follow up here with this variations article and the webinar presentation. So thanks, Fernando.
Thank you. So let me share the screen. presentation. Push this. All right. I believe that looks okay, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, thank you, Clara and Keith, for organizing this special issue, organizing the webinar. As Clara was just saying, is kind of a new application, a different application of initial condition ensembles, and kind of present kind of a perspective of how they can be useful for the air quality community. So kind of a different community, although connected to climate, of course. Let me begin just by also thanking a few additional folks. James East, student at North Carolina State, he helped put together this article for the Variations newsletter, and also special thanks to Arlene Fiore and Dan Horton from Columbia and Northwestern University. They provided a lot of valuable comments about this article, feedback that kind of was, I thought, made it a lot stronger and was kind of a valuable contribution to the article as well. So thanks to them. Get started. So there's been a lot of work from the air quality community looking at projecting the impacts of climate change on air quality. So a lot of studies have looked at different ways to project how air quality is going to change under different climate scenarios, different emissions and climate scenarios. And this is just kind of an outline of how most of those studies approach the problem, beginning with projections of greenhouse gas emissions and economic activity, using those, of course, to drive climate models, global circulation models, get projections of climate and meteorology, and then using those to drive simulations of air quality or atmospheric chemistry, either at global scales or then downscale to regional scales. Some studies have projected public health implications of those changes in air quality. And so there's a couple of kind of different ways to go about it. Along these greenhouse gas emissions trajectories, of course, there's also emissions of conventional air pollutants and conventional air pollutant precursors. So you can just capture that effect. But if you want to capture the interactions between climate and air quality, then you have to simulate or have to take these projections of climate, use those to either interact or drive an atmospheric chemistry model, and see those impacts of climate change on air quality. And there's many coupled mechanisms, of course, through which air quality and climate can interact. Interactions in the form of atmospheric chemistry, ventilation rates, natural emissions, deposition rates, a lot of different ways in which these interactions may occur. And if we have kind of an increase, a climate-induced increase in air pollution, then then we usually call that the climate penalty on air quality. So that's going to be the focus of what I'm going to be talking about for this presentation, the climate-induced impact on air quality. As I said, substantial amount of research projecting these impacts of climate change on air pollution. But most of the prior studies have used a single model and a single initial condition to drive their climate projections, or projections based on a single model, single initialization. To account for natural variability, they tend to just use time slices. So number of years at present, number of years of air quality at future, trying to capture to some degree internal variability, but those time slices typically tend to be 10 years or less, very often less than 10 years, sometimes less than 5 years. And it's really only been a small subset of studies that have included initial condition ensembles up to this point. The group of studies, which I'll be talking about, driven by an MIT model, the MIT Integrated Global System Model, MIT IGSM. We've used those with a small initial condition ensemble. There's also a few studies using different initial conditions based on the GFDL chemistry climate model. More recently, one study by Xu and Lamarck using CESM to look at interactions between climate and aerosols with a larger number of ensemble members. They're very small, kind of a small subset of studies. This table that we included in the article pretty much summarizes efforts that have used initial condition ensembles in the past, looking at air quality. All right, so I'm going to be talking about one of those efforts, just to kind of show an example of what initial condition ensembles can do for air quality. As I said, we're using an MIT IGSM modeling framework, using ChemChem, which is the atmospheric component of CESM for the actual atmospheric chemistry simulations. So driven by those projections of climate from the MIT IGSM, and then a couple of models to do the health and economic impacts when we do that. I'm focusing on the climate-induced impact, so that climate penalty that I was just describing. So that means holding the emissions of conventional air pollutants and precursors constant at start of the century levels. And we're basically focusing on the major sources of climate uncertainty within these projections. So we're looking at emission scenario uncertainty, of course, and that's been most of the focus of the studies looking at climate impacts on air quality that have been done in the past. But we're also going beyond kind of the traditional 5 or perhaps up to 10-year time slice to capture internal variability by using, as I said, a small initial condition ensemble with 5 members and extending kind of those time slices to 30 years each. This goes beyond, even though it's much smaller than the large ensembles we may be hearing from the climate perspective, it went kind of far beyond what was typically done for air quality projections. And using this modeling framework, we can also kind of test to some degree the uncertainty or the sensitivity to climate model response. This model allows us to, there's a method we can use to tweak kind of the climate sensitivity within the model. We've also changed that sensitivity within our simulations to really compare these different sources of uncertainty. And so very quickly, these are kind of the ensemble mean projections that we were getting from this modeling framework. The figures here on the left kind of compare the scenario uncertainty. So when you have a climate policy versus no policy, so business as usual scenario versus these climate stabilization policies, what does that mean as far as the climate penalty or climate-induced changes in ozone and PM2.5? And so these are the ensemble mean projections under these different emission scenarios that we've used in the past. We can convert that to exposure to a population-weighted change in pollutant concentrations, and then convert that to different health outcomes, including changes in mortality by mid-century or end of century. In this case, specifically for a reference scenario relative, or a policy stabilization scenario relative to a business as usual reference scenario. However, this modeling framework, what it did allow us to do was to take a much closer look at internal variability within these projections by using these larger time slices and also using a small initial condition ensemble. So in this case, I've blown up those ensemble mean projections to show you just the degree of variability within individual years or individual ensemble members. So these are just examples of individual annual projections of ozone season climate penalty. You can see a lot of variation between different years. So single years where it would appear that the entire country is experiencing a penalty, other years where it would appear that most of the country is actually experiencing a benefit from climate as far as kind of ozone season, ozone concentrations. Very quickly, similar things for PM2.5. So ground level PM2.5, also large variations across these individual years and different ensemble members, sometimes reflecting a benefit or sometimes suggesting a benefit. The ensemble mean, of course, suggesting a climate penalty associated with both ozone and PM2.5. So that really allowed us to take a closer look for the first time at internal variability within these projections. As I said, we've kind of taken this and calculated annual mortalities or different health outcomes associated with a changing climate. And so the figures here on the left just show you kind of avoided mortalities. Each point is an individual ensemble member. And we do that for the 30-year time slices. So we're showing this relative to the start of the century, at mid-century and end of century. And you can see this wide range of variations between the avoided mortalities that are projected. We can translate that into economic impacts using the value of the statistical life. And it really leads to this massive spread in economic benefits or economic impacts associated with climate policy when we account for natural variability. As I said, just very quickly, we've also tried to include the impact of model response by changing the climate sensitivity within our simulations. Climate sensitivity of 3 degrees C per doubling of CO2, that's the maps in the middle column, but we've increased that to 4.5 and decreased it to 2 degrees C. And so the maps on the right and left show to what degree climate would impact the concentrations further or lesser, depending on the climate sensitivity. That really allowed us to now take a kind of a closer look at these 3 major sources of uncertainty: natural variability or internal variability within our model, the emissions or policy, and climate sensitivity kind of as an indicator of climate model response. And so these are kind of the ranges. So here we're using the range and climate-induced ozone change for each source of uncertainty. So we hold the other 2 sources of uncertainty in a way kind of constant and see kind of the range across these 3 major components of uncertainty. And what we can see is that initially, the uncertainty associated with emissions is of course very small because we have those emission scenarios don't deviate too much. The uncertainty associated with variability is larger. That stays constant. The uncertainty associated with natural variability stays pretty constant throughout the entire century. By mid-century, that's comparable to the policy and climate sensitivity uncertainties. And then by the end of the century, it's really policy that takes over, climate sensitivity to a smaller degree, but the uncertainty associated with internal variability is still significant. Similar story for PM 2.5, just looking at different areas with the larger impacts on climate-induced impacts on PM 2.5 concentrations. But again, a fairly constant uncertainty associated with internal variability. And towards the end of the century, is when really policy dominates that uncertainty, and to a lesser degree, climate sensitivity. These are those same numbers, but kind of summarized as a population-weighted metric. So as you can see, again, by mid-century, all of them pretty comparable, same order of magnitude, same kind of range of uncertainty coming from these 3 sources. And it's not until the end of the century, when we look at population, these are US population-weighted concentrations, that the scenario really starts to dominate. But internal variability still plays kind of a significant role and adds a significant amount of uncertainty. So as I said, let me just summarize the main point I think that we wanted to convey with this article, and also the people that provided input want to share this point, is that we do think that large ensembles offer a very exciting opportunity. The smaller ensembles that have been used before revealed that the approach can be useful, provide useful insights. We think they'd be especially helpful to kind of explain some of the discrepancies among projections, especially for things like PM 2.5. There's some discrepancies between different models as far as how climate may impact those pollutant concentrations. So we think that these large ensembles can provide a useful tool. They can also be helpful to kind of simultaneously explore the impacts of climate change and anthropogenic emissions. Here we kept kind of conventional air pollutant emissions at start of the century levels, but large ensembles could provide a way to go beyond that and go beyond kind of the time slice approach that has been used in the past. So we really would like to see a single model large ensemble, which hasn't been developed, with fully coupled chemistry and climate that can serve as an initial step and motivate future large ensembles, multi-model large ensembles with interactive atmospheric chemistry that can use for different applications, health and air quality, of course. So I'm sorry I went a bit over, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Fernando. Any questions for him? I don't see any movement. If you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and he can probably answer it there. Should we go on to the next speaker, Clara?
Sure, sounds good. Thank you so much, Fernando. So wonderful to see all this research. So now we will move from air quality to marine biogeochemistry. And Sarah Schlunegger from Princeton University will give a presentation. Please go ahead, Sarah. Thank you.
Okay, hi. So Our article was about applications of marine biogeochemistry, applications of large ensembles for marine biogeochemistry. Okay, so as an outline, first I'll go over motivation for why we like to use large ensembles in marine biogeochemistry, and then a survey of large ensemble applications for marine biogeochemistry that we highlighted in our article. First, the use of large ensembles for studying emergence properties and observing system design, and then mechanisms of variability, and finally, ecological applications. So very broadly, we study ocean biogeochemistry because the ocean serves as a large sink for anthropogenic carbon. 25 to 40% of the anthropogenic emissions wind up in the ocean. And then also the ocean is the planet's largest habitat. And the invasion of carbon and the invasion of heat give pause to the ability of the ocean in the future to continue taking up carbon, as well as to continue serving as a habitat for many marine organisms. But the evolution of the ocean carbon sinks in the future and the ability of the ocean to maintain its status as a habitat is dependent on processes that occur within the ocean, which is why we use Earth system models that have a ocean carbon chemistry model inside. So within the ocean, carbon is sequestered by both physical mechanisms as well as biological mechanisms. And these mechanisms are important because they're also coupled to processes that we care quite a bit about, including the overall climate sensitivity. The partitioning of carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean is set by processes within the ocean that transport carbon. And then, of course, the pace of acidification is tied to the ocean carbon sink. And then the function of the marine food web, as well as ocean deoxygenation, is also tied to the biological and physical carbon pumps. And a lot of scientific effort has been put into understanding how the ocean carbon sink has evolved over the historical period, as well as predicting how it will evolve in the future. So current estimates have the strength of the ocean carbon sink at 2 petagrams carbon per year, which is anticipated to increase due to anthropogenic forcing by 4 to 6 petagrams carbon per year by end of century. And the biological transport of carbon in the ocean is also very important for the marine food web and oxygen, as well as climate sensitivity. Currently, it's 10 petagrams carbon per year mean state, anticipated to reduce by about a petagram carbon per year. However, there's been growing appreciation for the influence of variability on the interannual to decadal timescale. So for the ocean carbon sink, natural variability documented to be about a petagram per year or more for the global ocean, and for biological transport of carbon, half a petagram carbon per year. And we can immediately see here that the anthropogenic signal, which is 4 to 6 petagrams carbon per year that occurs over a century, is of the same order of magnitude as the variability that can be expressed within a single year. So we see that we have a signal to noise issue for observations, as well as in some cases for modeling. And so why is it that the ocean carbon sink and biological export are variable? And of course, one dominant driver is climate mode variability. So we've transitioned here to like a La Nina state, and as the low latitudes can push carbon up from the deep ocean, see the thermocline rise, CO2 can be exhausted to the atmosphere. And then also in a La Nina state, there's changes in the irradiance at the surface, which impacts photosynthesis, as well as changing and mixing within the ocean can change the amount of nutrients provided for photosynthesis. And so these type of reorganizations of the physical climate feedback and alter the variability of important climate metrics, as well as those for the habitability of the ocean. So we use large ensembles because we want to understand how large this anthropogenic component is, and variability, and understand them in space and time, both to understand the historical period as well as for projections. So one of the first wave of uses of large ensembles in ocean biogeochemistry was to understand when different changes in the ocean would become emergent. And this gives us a gauge on what type of observing system we need and also when these impacts might occur. So if we start in year 1990, this is an event timeline for when changes in the ocean globally might occur. And the first set of changes here is related to carbonic chemistry. And we see that changes in pH and alkalinity and calcification emerge quite early, as these are very sensitive to the invasion of anthropogenic carbon into the ocean. And then after this, sometime mid-century, changes in the heat content of the ocean emerge. And then finally, towards the end of century, you can start to see the slow adjustment of the ocean's physical state to the changes in the temperature profile, as well as changes in atmospheric forcings like salinity and heat and wind. And because of these changes in the physical ocean, changes in the biological components of the ocean start to emerge. So changes in mixing and stratification reduce nutrients to the upper ocean, and changes in biological productivity and oxygen utilization ensue. So this is a summary for the GFDL large ensemble. However, it's pretty representative of many other Earth system models large ensemble studies, as well as representative of other studies that use different methods for determining time of emergence. So this is a rather robust chronology or narrative for understanding when changes occur. And we see here that there's quite a wide range of emergence timescales, from under a decade for changes in carbonic chemistry to over a century for the slower changes in circulation and nutrients and biology. And this diversity of emergence times also occurs within the same variable but over space. So there's also a lot of regional heterogeneity in when certain signals will emerge. So for example, if we look at air-sea CO2 flux here in the middle, the North Atlantic sees emergence timescales around 20 to 30 years versus the subtropical North Pacific takes a century or longer to have an emergent signal in air-sea CO2 fluxes. So this gives us indication of what an observing system might need to look like. It needs to span a long time scale and have a large spatial footprint in order to capture these changes. So next, we highlighted studies which looked at mechanisms of variability. So Edebar et al. 2019 uses two large ensembles to understand the forced response of the climate and biogeochemistry to volcanic eruptions. So we see here that changes in primary production, air-sea CO2 flux, and air-sea oxygen flux have pronounced responses to the eruption of three important volcanoes over the historical period. And this study found that a lot of the variability observed over the historical period in these key biological parameters can be attributed to volcanic eruptions alone. The other study of variability that large ensembles are uniquely positioned to address is how variability changes over time. And this is particularly useful for nonlinear systems like that of carbonic chemistry. So this figure shows the amplification of CO2 flux variability in the future relative to the historical. And this occurs because the partial pressure of CO2 in the surface ocean becomes more sensitive to environmental variables as the world warms and as the background concentrations of carbon increase. And then finally, we highlight some ecological applications of large ensembles. So here, a study by Berger et al. Shows changes in the extreme acidification events. So we can see an increase in acidity, increase in hydrogen ion concentration. And if the ensemble mean is removed, it reveals that there's a variance change in the system towards having more extreme hydrogen ion events. And this is on top of a background increase in acidification. Other studies have considered more species-specific impacts, including a study that looked at the onset of critical acidification events for pteropods, and another study that used large ensemble output to force an offline ecological model of coccolithophore growth and calcification rates. So as an outlook, we note that there's synergies between large ensembles and decadal prediction efforts that we think will continue and should continue. We think there's more to come, or more science to be done, on isolating internal versus external variability over the observational period. We think about new experiments that should be run or analyzed, which are single forcing large ensembles to more precisely isolate the biogeochemical influence of different drivers, so aerosols versus volcanic, and then also potentially a prognostic or emissions-based large ensemble, rather than the current large ensembles are all diagnostic or concentration-based. And emissions-based large ensemble would give a more representative coupling of the carbon cycle across different components. And then finally, there's large archives now available with multiple large ensembles, and leveraging those will lead to advances in the separation of internal variability from the forced trend from model uncertainty. Okay. Questions?
Thank you, Sarah. Do we have any questions for her? We have a pretty quiet group. If we do have additional time at the end, maybe we can take more questions then. So let's move on to the next speaker. Go ahead, Clara.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much, Sarah. I think each one of these presentations is just superb, and I think everybody is taking it in. So appreciate it very much. I wanted to just follow up now that we've heard a few talks. I think you can see that there are a lot of forward-looking things yet to be done with large ensembles. And the working group is now considering perhaps convening a follow-up large ensemble workshop maybe at the end of summer of 2021, if that becomes possible in this COVID era. And perhaps we'll also add a hackathon to that. So stay tuned. We will be sure to communicate any potential plans, but I'm very hopeful that we can do that. Okay, so our fourth speaker, fourth out of fifth, Laura Suarez-Gutierrez from the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology, and she will be speaking about model evaluation, how to evaluate internal variability and force response in models given this uncertainty from internal variability. So please go ahead, Laura.
Thank you. Do you see the screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you for having me. So today I will be telling you a little bit about exploiting large ensembles for a more effective evaluation of the internal variability and force response in climate models. And this is work that I've done in collaboration with my colleagues Nicola Mayer and Sebastian Linsky. So I will introduce you today to our climate model evaluation framework. This evaluation framework goes beyond what we're used to do by comparing mean states and variability proxies and things like that, and allows us to determine whether the whole simulated distribution, including its tails, captures what we observe. So this evaluation framework relies on large ensembles for the well-defined time-evolving force response and probability distribution around this response caused by internal variability, and is based on a very simple approach, evaluating whether observations occur evenly across the ensemble spread and mainly within the limits of the ensemble. So to test this evaluation framework today, I will use the case based of North American surface air temperatures and during the historical period. So we will use North American SATs for 5 climate model large ensembles and the observational large ensemble, as you see in that table. And for those of you not familiar with the observational large ensemble, this is a statistical product combining the forced response and ZSM with an estimated of internal variability derived from observations. So we will use this climate data and we will evaluate it against observations for the CRU-TAM4 dataset. So as I mentioned before, we will be basing this evaluation on a simple question. Are observations distributed evenly and within the ensemble spread? So to test this, we will use rank frequency analysis. And here you see an example of this with one of the ensembles that I use, the MPI Grand Ensemble. So on the left, you see a time series of North American SATs in orange for the ensemble, and in black for the observations. And in the left, you see the rank frequency histogram. So what is the rank? The rank is the place that the observations take in a list of ensemble members ordered by ascending SATs. So if observations are observed temperature are smaller than the temperature simulated by all ensemble members in a given year, the rank in a given year is 0. And if observations are larger than the temperature in all ensemble members, the rank is n for that year, with n being the number of ensemble members. So for example, in a year with rank 0, and the black dot will lay somewhere below the ensemble minimum, and for a year with rank n, as you see a couple of times here, the observations will lay above the ensemble maximum, and you can see those two frequencies as crosses here. So for a model that perfectly captures observations, observations will take all ranks with similar frequency, meaning that a model that adequately captures observations has a rank histogram that is roughly flat and a low rank 0 and rank n frequencies. So based on this, now we can see this analysis for all of the large ensembles considered here. So as I was telling you before, the MPI Grand Ensemble has a pretty flat rank histogram, and this is also true for CSM and the FDL-ESM large ensembles, and for the observational large ensembles. You don't see the average so well here. So for these model large ensembles that have flat rank histograms, it means that they agree well with what we observe, and they capture this range of observations. And this is not so true for large ensembles from models such as CANI-SM and CESIRO. For these two models, you see that they don't have a flat histogram, but rather sloped, with too high low rank and rank 0 frequencies, meaning that observations tend to occur in the lower half of the ensemble spreads or even below the ensemble minimums, because these models overestimate force warming in this region. And this is only one type of bias that the flat rank histogram can highlight. Depending on its shape, it might highlight others that do not occur in this case, and I'm happy to discuss later. So now we can take these concepts of evenly distributed observations across the ensemble spread to refine our analysis even more on the grid cell level. And this is what I will show you next. So a spatial evaluation of the concepts that we've just gone over, illustrated by this type of shading. So the shadings that you see here highlight different types of biases. For example, you see shading that is blue, means that in these regions, observations are smaller than all ensemble members for a high number of years. If the shading is red, it means that observations are larger than all ensemble members for some years. And if observations are gray, it means that observations cluster in the center of the ensemble spread too frequently. So for a model that perfectly captures observations, we will expect observations to fall within the 75th percentile central range of the ensemble for 75% of the years. And if observations cluster in the center of the ensemble more frequently than this, it means that the ensemble is overestimating the variability. So these types of shadings, as I was saying, highlight different types of biases, which are as follows. If we have a region with only blue or only red shading, it means that the model respectively over or underestimates the force response in observations. When you have blue and red shading together, it likely means that the model underestimates the internal variability in the region, with observations occurring both above and below the ensemble limits. And when you have a gray area, it means that the model overestimates the internal variability. And lastly, the white areas highlight regions where the model shows no significant biases. And we can have this overall percentage of white areas as a final ranking for our evaluation in this case. So these results that you see here are for the CANI-SM2 large ensemble. And now I will show you for all of the large ensembles used. So as you see, there is some blue shading for CANI-SM and CSIRO, as we talked before about these models overestimating the forced warming. This is true in the northern part of the domain. And there's also regions with red shading for models as CSM or CSIRO, meaning that in these models, in this area, the models underestimate. The warming and observations are often more extreme or warmer than the model can simulate. We also find some areas, so similar areas across many models that show gray shading, indicating that these ensembles overestimate the variability in these regions, and observations occur in the center of the spread. And this means that the extremes simulated by these models are systematically more extreme, both cold and warm extremes are more extreme than what we observe. And lastly, we have some areas of red and blue shading that indicate underestimated variability in the Caribbean islands and the Baja California Peninsula, and this is likely due to resolution issues and orography in the models. So with this percentage of wear area, now we see which models show the less bias area for the case of North American surface air temperatures, and offer therefore the best representation of the combined effect of internal variability and the force response. And these models in order, or these ensembles in order, are the observational large ensemble, the MPI ground ensemble, CANI-SM, and ZSM large ensembles. So we've answered the question of which large ensembles provide the best representation of the combined effect of internal variability and forced response in observations for our case study of North American surface air temperatures in the historical period. We find that due to this experimental design on observational large ensemble, it offers the best representation of this combined effect of force response and variability in observations. And the climate models that offer this best representation of observations are the MPI ground ensemble, CANI-SM large ensemble, and ZSM large ensemble. So this would mean that therefore these models are the best choice to study future temperature projections for this region. So with this evaluation framework, we give users the possibility to decide which models are the most appropriate for the value and region of interest by evaluating how climate models capture the real world observations more effectively and robustly than ever before, thanks to large ensembles. And with this, I leave you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Laura. Any questions for her?
I had a question for you, Laura. Have you extended this work to other regions of the globe? And or do you plan to, and or other variables such as precipitation?
Yeah, so we're currently working on a paper evaluating the same thing that I've shown you here with more in-detail analysis of periods and so for the whole globe. And we're going to use air temperature as well as sea surface temperature and 10 large ensembles. So we're working on that, and they'll be coming out hopefully in Science Advances soon. But so far, we've only planned on doing this for temperature. And the reason being, this works best if you have a large sample of observations. So for observations that have a very long record, you have a good chance of capturing different modes of multi-indicator variability, for example, or just very large samples of the streams. And then you can assess this much better. And for precipitation, the global coverage is not as good and not as long. You could definitely do it in particular regions, but yeah, we are not planning on doing so yet. But I'll be looking forward to seeing it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think it's also important, your approach for evaluating the statistical emulation of the observed variability. You've used one rendition for the observational large ensemble, but I hope that there will be others that will come online, and then you can apply your method for those as well, because I think that's very important as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's actually true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for comment.
Yeah. That's great.
We do have a question in the chat box. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Gabor Drotos. He asks, I don't have a microphone, so just have a question for Laura. Climate is changing and the performance of a given model may change correspondingly. Have you tried evaluating the performance in different subintervals of the time frame presented here, even if the reliability of the results decreases with decreasing interval length?
Yes, actually, that's a big point of the longer paper that we're working on. So it is crucial to repeat this analysis for different periods where the climate is submitted to different extents of anthropogenic effects. So for different levels of global warming, and we find that actually models do perform differently for different periods. So for example, the example of Kania's M2, it performs pretty well in the pre-industrial era, and it stops performing so well in recent decades because it has a slightly high equilibrium climate sensitivity. So yes, definitely that's a very important point and that we need to consider. And there's also the question whether this evaluation of observations will really tell us which models are best to use for projections. So of course, in the future, models might behave worse than they're doing now, and that's something that cannot really be addressed with only observations.
Any other questions? All right, want to move on to the next and final speaker, Clara?
Yes. Okay, so now we are at our fifth speaker, and this will be Daniel Topal, and from Budapest and University of California, Santa Barbara, and he will speak about detecting forced changes in internal variability. And this is something that we've heard hinted at from the previous speakers. I think Sarah mentioned it, and possibly Rob and Laura as well. So I think it's a very important aspect that we may have to grapple with, especially as climate change strengthens, whether our patterns of internal variability actually respond in some way to the external forcing. So with that, I will hand it over to Danielle. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Clara and Keith, for inviting us for having this presentation and to do variation article. I'm going to present our variations article with Timea Hospra and Matja Scherein. It's about detecting forced changes in internal variability using the so-called snapshot view. The word snapshot will gain its meaning in a few moments. So when characterizing internal variability of the climate system, we know that climate dynamics allows for finite number of states at any time instant, that is an ensemble of states from which the observed one is only one sample. Thus, the distribution of all possible climate states allowed by chaos defines a probability distribution, which is called internal variability. This is an inherent uncertainty affecting model projections. Note that internal variability, in this sense, is an instantaneous quantity, that is, it can be subject of change with time. Internal variability is only constant without external forcing. If we introduce, for example, anthropogenic forcing, the chaotic system allowed by the chaos, the distribution will change of the climate states allowed by chaos, and it will change its shape as well. This introduces another kind of uncertainty affecting future climate projections, and all this is a consequence of general properties of chaotic systems. So using large ensembles, new perspectives open for detecting forced changes in internal variability, and because the members of the ensemble constitute the modeled internal variability at any time instant, which will be referred as the snapshot taken over the ensemble. This is what a title refers to. That is, we perform traditional temporal statistics using the ensemble dimension. In this way, the traditional time-based statistics transform into ensemble-based statistics, where the time dimension is replaced by the dimension of the ensemble members. So on the first plot on the left, you can see the data matrix with time, which transforms into the data matrix of ensemble members at any time instant. I have to stress that on the right there is time 1 and on the left there is member 1. So this snapshot approach allows us to monitor the temporal evolution of internal variability. And importantly, we can use any statistical methods to formulate its ensemble-based version. And I'd like to introduce this method and exemplify it using the snapshot empirical orthogonal function analysis, which is the same as the traditional one, but we compute EOFs across the ensemble. In this way, the ensemble mean will be removed before the EOF, so it only characterizes the true internal variability of the model. We define both the Arctic oscillation mode and the AO index as instantaneous quantities and monitor the time evolution. A time instant for now is boreal winter mean sea level pressure. On the left figure, the AO mode is exhibited in 2025 across the ensemble, so in that time instant for DJF in 2025. As remember that we can do EOF at any time instant across the ensemble, and thus we get many EOF modes, as many time steps we have, and then we can do regression to detect any changes in the AO mode. In the right figure, the black crosses indicate where significant changes happen in the AO mode until 2099 in the CESM large ensemble. This means that the action centers of the Arctic oscillation are not constant. They can change due to external forcing. Having defined the AO instantaneously, we get the AO index as the first principal component time series, which is of length the number of the total number of the ensemble. In this case, it is 40. And then we can correlate the AO index with surface temperature at any instant, again across the ensemble. Thus, we get a time-dependent correlation coefficient time series, which refers to the strength of the connection between the Arctic oscillation mode and surface temperature. And it is shown in the figure. As it's moving, it is demonstrating that the correlation between the surface temperature and the Arctic oscillation index is far not constant. It is changing with time. And we can fit a regression line to this correlation coefficient time series and use and show it on the right as a linear regression map. The right figure exhibits pronounced future changes in the correlation between the Arctic oscillation index and surface temperature. And I'll refer to the Journal of Climate paper came out in January, the Hospra et al. And this can be read further. As another example of making use of the so-called snapshot approach, let's raise the question, what role the differing amount of external forcing plays in modulating changes in internal variability. And in this way, the scenario uncertainty and the uncertainty regarding changes in internal variability may be studied simultaneously. I will demonstrate this on the example of atmospheric drivers of summertime Arctic sea ice melt in another large ensemble, the Max Planck Institute Ground Ensemble. To ensure clarity, let me quickly go through the steps of the calculation. So first, we calculate linear trends of 200 hectopascal geopotential height, Z200, and sea ice concentration in the Arctic in each member of the MPI Ground Ensemble for 2020, 2050, so the next 3 decades. And then remove the ensemble mean linear trend from Z200 and sea ice concentration respectively. So as a result, we have the Z200 and sea ice concentration linear trend spatial patterns in each member of the MPI-GE. So 100 pieces of Z200 and 100 pieces of sea ice concentration spatial linear trend patterns times the 3 RCP scenarios available in the MPI-GE. And then we do maximum covariance analysis between trends of Z200 and the sea ice concentration across the ensemble, all 3 scenarios. So note that the previously mentioned snapshot now is 30-year trends. So it's like giving a low-pass filtering to the data. And notice that the time expansion coefficients of the maximum covariance analysis in the ensemble-based version will not reflect temporal information, but member information, and it will reflect the relative importance of each member in the coupling between Z200, the atmosphere circulation, and sea ice. So we can use these time expansion coefficients to probe linearity between the covariability of Z200 with sea ice concentration. And how do we do this? First, let's calculate also the linear trends of the total sea ice area index in each member. I know it's a lot of calculations, just I hope you follow. So we have now in each member the total sea ice area index as well, which is the common definition, the sum of all grid points with at least 15% of ice concentration, and plot it against the time expansion coefficients. And we order it ascending order by the MCA1 loading, so the time expansion coefficients. So the orange bars represent the time expansion coefficients of each member in ascending order. So this member on the left has the strongest coupling and also has the fastest melt, because the blue bars represent the sea ice area trends in the corresponding members, so the same member. So we can use this to determine linearity between the coupling, because if the coupling was fully linear, then the decrease of time expansion coefficients, which is linear, reflecting loading of each member, would be accompanied by a monotone decrease of sea ice area trends. So we can see that in the three RCP scenarios at A, D, and G, we have RCP 2.6 on the top and RCP 4.5 in the middle. We can see that the blue bars and the orange bars follow each other pretty well on the case of the 2.6 and 8.5. But in the middle scenario, there are some members with decreasing loading in the coupling based on the MCA, but those members, sea ice area trends, still show pretty good melting. So it's not decreasing monotonously. And this can give us a hint that the coupling between Z200 and sea ice is not fully linear, because there might be some other processes playing a role in the coupling. So I just highlight these two edges of the distribution because this is the true for the slow sea ice melting group as well. So they get the right hand of the distribution, and I could repeat that as well. So as a summary, at the first side of the presentation, we learned that current atmospheric teleconnection patterns may change due to anthropogenic forcing, and it's another kind of uncertainty affecting future model predictions, and it needs to be taken into account. And importantly, any traditional time series-based analysis can be reformulated using the snapshot view, so taken over the ensemble instead of the time axis, and because possible climate states at each time instant can be properly characterized in this way. And I would like to show some references for further learning. I did not use references in the presentation, I just left them here. There are some new studies as well it's only a preprint, and other papers are already published. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel. Any questions for him?
Danielle, I guess I had a question. You didn't really address it. How will you, we've heard from the other speakers, how to bring in the observations for evaluating the models and understanding the models. How do you bring in observations into sort of, to be able to compare with your snapshot EOFs? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's a current project. We're doing it, and we can use, as Laura mentioned, different length and different kind of time intervals to evaluate against the EOF. And I saw that the snapshot EOF, and we showed in the paper, resembles the observed EUF. So the model is pretty good at representing the Arctic oscillation. This is a very good point to raise, because at first, before doing any snapshot analysis, we have to make sure that the model is good enough, because our base hypothesis is that the model is perfect in this case. And the only uncertainty affecting the snapshot method is the size of the ensemble, but only if the model is perfect enough. So in this way, we can do model evaluation. But first, as Clara mentioned, we have to make sure that the EUF patterns are well captured in the model. And actually, we did that. So the CSM does a pretty good job replicating this in the wintertime atmospheric circulation.
Thank you.
There is a question in the chat box from Yakunan Kushnir. Yes, aren't you concerned with the impact of the natural continuum nature of low frequency variability in the northern hemisphere? For example, Frankie and Fieldstein, 2005.
Let me check the. Sorry, I have to read the question again, sir. I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you help me out what this refers to, if anybody understands?
I think maybe I can jump in. Johannan, if you are able to unmute, please do. But if not,
yeah, I
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, there is the low frequency variability in the northern hemisphere has a continuum nature. In other words, patterns are not always located at the same place. Those dipoles, like the North Atlantic Oscillation or the AO pattern, and they keep wandering all over the place. How do you make sure that you are not sampling this continuum when you're doing the snapshot EOF method?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Actually, we see this seesaw in the snapshot EOF. Well, we can make sure using larger ensembles as the MPI Grand Ensemble with 100 members, and we showed pretty this is robust. So the EOFs are changing not only due to the seesaw. So my answer would be just use larger ensemble size, maybe with an intermediate complexity climate model. We could generate 1,000, 10,000 members and check if we don't sample that, what you're mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question from Mark Kane. How do the shifts you find in time compare with either observed changes over time or model internal variations?
Yeah, so this is also the question referring to Clara's, I think. So compare with the next. So the idea here is that we cannot compare the snapshot method directly to observations, because its formulations are from a different perspective. So it's theory based, the snapshot method, and the observation is only one realization of what we observe in chaos. So we'll never be able to compare those. So we're only looking for the best solution if we would like to compare observations with the snapshot method. And I cannot really answer the question because it's ongoing work and I'm currently looking at the figures. So if you can hit me an email later, we can talk about it. I have some figures ready so we can continue the discussion.
Thank you, Daniel. Any other questions for him or even for other authors?
I guess I feel like there might be some synergies between what Rob presented for the pattern recognition, maybe to try to adopt that into the snapshot view. That would be a way forward that might be very interesting.
Absolutely. And we're looking for collaborators as well. So if anybody has any further questions, you can reach me and don't hesitate.
Good.
All right. If there are no further questions, I would like to thank Rob, Fernando, Sarah, Laura, and Daniel for presenting at today's webinar and for contributing articles to this variations edition on large ensembles. And a big thank you to Clara and Keith for leading the organization. As I said, a recording of the webinar will be available later this week, and an announcement will be made through our US Clara communication modes, so Twitter, website, and Newsgram. And lastly, feel free to reach out to me if you would like to keep up with other large ensemble news, including the working group activities. Keep an eye out for our next variations, which will focus on US East Coast sea level changes and impacts, which should be coming out this fall. And Claire and Keith, do you guys have any final words before we end the webinar?
I don't. I just want to thank everyone. There's been great attendance, and I think you've gotten the attention of a wide community here. So I'm really pleased, and I hope that this next year continues with this forward-looking research, making use of large ensembles, and that we can all convene in some way, maybe a year from now, to share our work. Thank you so much to all the speakers.
And likewise, likewise. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and thank you to the speakers. It was a really great effort and opening our eyes to new directions.